Good evening, everybody. I'm Arif McCoy, and with the team, with Phil, Nikki, Eugene, and Tara, we organized the ISCO meetups. ISCO is a membership organization, and our website, isco.org, iscouk.org, holds a repository for all previous ISCO events. And also, there are information about the benefits of the membership on that site. Also, ISCO publicizes the upcoming events. And this year, ISCO has a conference in July. During the presentation, your mics would be put on mute. And please add your questions to the chat box where we can go through them after the talk. The entire session would be recorded and you can watch it or listen to it on the ISCO website. I have the pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Tony Russell-Rose, who is currently a senior lecturer in computer science at Goldsmiths University of London and Royal Academy of Engineering visiting professor of cognitive computing at Essex University. He's also director of UX Labs, a research and design consultancy specializing in complex search and information access applications. Most recently, he is founder of the 2D Search, a startup applying AI and NLP and data visualization to create the next generation of professional search tools with applications in legal research, patent search, evidence synthesis, and recruitment sourcing. I pass it to Tony. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Arif. Thank you for that kind introduction. I hope you can all hear me okay. I do have a proper mic, but I understand that that you can hear me okay so far, just using this regular mic. Is that right?
Yes.
All right, that's great. All right, so I will share my screen, if you just bear with me a moment. Right, can everybody see my desktop? You should be seeing some slides.
Yes.
Is that correct? Great. All right. So now I'm just going to try and do the clever maneuver in Zoom that allows you to see the chat window at the same time. So just bear with me a second. There is a magic incantation I know that allows me to see the chat at the same time. So I can just remember what it is. Oh, there it is. That's it. So I've got the chat window now. So I think we're all good to go. All right. Great. So yeah, so thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I've had some contact with the ISCO community before, some very productive conversations. I think I gave a talk at the ISCO conference probably back in 2019, I think, and I've also given a talk for ISCO Singapore. So it's always a pleasure to renew the acquaintance with this community. So I'm going to talk for about half an hour. And then switch over to Q&A. If anybody's got any questions, please do let me know. If I mention any jargon that's not immediately apparent, just feel free to stop me. I will try and keep an eye on the chat. If I miss anything, then please do feel free to raise a hand or nag me or just grab my attention in some other way. Okay. So with that, I will start. So just to follow up on Arif's warm introduction, a background, I work at the intersection of natural language processing, information retrieval, and HCI, human-computer interaction or user experience. And I kind of straddled two careers. I've sort of always had a foot in the academic camp, but for most of the last 22 decades or so, I've been in sort of what you might call industrial R&D and also in consulting. So I've kind of done the full spectrum, if you want to look at it that way, of consulting to blue skies R&D. So here's some of the things that I've done in the past, some of the organisations that I've worked for. As I've said, I'm a visiting professor at Essex, and I also run UX Labs, a small consultancy, and I've part of the one of the spin-offs from that consultancy is something called 2D Search, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today, as part of a bigger picture around sort of reinventing advanced search and rethinking the whole search paradigm. If that doesn't sound too grandiose, I hope it doesn't. So that's my background. So let's get started. So really the topic of what I'm going to be talking about today is what I call professional search, right? So you probably, I'm guessing that most people on this call will sort of have a sense of what I mean by that term, but perhaps not the full details. So allow me to clarify. So we all use search on a daily basis, right? We all rely on Google and Bing and our favorite search engines. As you know, as consumers, you know, it's a vital part. It's woven into the fabric of our everyday lives. But there are some people out there who need it more than others, and I'm guessing that there's a significant proportion of people on this call who would probably fall into that category, for whom search is actually part of what they do in their daily jobs. And I'm talking about the sort of people who perhaps do pattern search, or perhaps do healthcare information professionals, or even those who work in recruitment, and I'll come into those just a second, and folks who work in media monitoring too. So for example, pattern searchers, there's a significant amount of, as you might imagine, money tied up in intellectual property. And part of the due diligence of what pattern searchers do is to do a full and complete prior art search. So they rely on search as part of their you know, daily jobs. Similarly with healthcare information professionals, you know, most of us, when we are diagnosed or prescribed or take part in some sort of healthcare intervention, that is usually based on evidence, and the evidence comes from the literature, and I'll talk a little bit about that process in a moment. And also recruitment in media, and I'll show a couple of examples of those too. So for these folks, keyword search generally isn't good enough because it isn't comprehensive enough. And in some senses, what we mean by that is it's recall oriented. It isn't necessarily repeatable, so there isn't the framework of due diligence and governance around it. And also it needs to be transparent and explainable. So these characteristics are, you know, underpin a lot of what takes place within, you know, professional environments, particularly around pattern search and healthcare information search, and also in other professions too. So so how is this done at the moment? Well, typically, these are the kind of tools that people use for doing what we call structured search or systematic search. So I won't talk too much about this. We've all seen these kind of search query builders before. They're predicated on the idea of a large form. You populate the form by entering typically keywords or controlled vocabulary terms, combine them together into Boolean expressions, and then you combine those Boolean expressions into a longer artifact that's typically referred to as a search strategy. And then that search strategy is the artifact that is the due diligence, the proof that you hopefully did your job properly as a pattern searcher or a healthcare information professional, or whatever your particular background is. So what is the artifact that comes out of these? Well, they tend to look a little bit like this. And here's one that actually comes from a systematic review. You can see the citation down there at the bottom. And I'm not going to read this line by line because clearly it's quite complex. And for some people, this looks like code. And in some ways, it is a bit like code. It certainly displays many of the attributes that we would associate with computer code. So we've got line numbers, we've got controlled vocabulary terms, we've got Boolean expressions, and we've got references to line numbers, references to lines using this numbering scheme. And this whole expression combines to create a large, as I said, search strategy that articulates that information need, that structured information need. And my thesis that I'm going to sort of elaborate during the course of this talk is that actually there are limitations with this approach, both in the formalism and the tooling, and that there are better ways of addressing this problem if we rethink the problem. Okay, now I would invite you at this point, those who are familiar with this kind of thing, and even if you're not, just to take a moment to read it and try and answer this one question. How many conceptual blocks are in this search strategy? And just indulge yourselves, take a moment, see if you can answer that question, and I'd be interested to see if anybody gets it right. We'll hold that thought and we'll come back to it a little bit later in the talk. So that's healthcare. I also mentioned recruitment. Now, those of us who ever had taken a phone call from a recruiter and we've heard the spiel saying, you know, we've got this perfect position for you, and they come out with this list of attributes and somehow they seem to match your profile. And you're probably thinking, well, how did they find out? How did they find me? And it turns out that recruiters live and breathe Boolean. In fact, if you were to search for the phrase Boolean strings on your favorite search engine, and I've just picked Google here, 9 out of the 10 first results will be either by or for recruiters. So these guys love this stuff, and they have a sort of subculture known as Boolean black belts, sort of ninjas who love this Boolean stuff. So there's a real culture embedded into the whole profession of living, breathing, and cultivating skills in Boolean search. And they create artifacts like this that we can see here in the top right. It's not that complicated, but it's complicated enough that it's a skill that they like to cultivate. And this particular one is to find, you know, Java developers with a certain set of competencies. And that would return a result like this. You know, if you enter that string exactly into Bing or your favorite search engine, you'll get this. You'll get a set of profiles like that, and that's generally how recruiters do the process of sourcing. So that's recruitment. I also mentioned pattern search, and we've got an example of a pattern search here over on the left. There might be some people on the call who do this sort of stuff, so you may be familiar with this. It's a similar sort of paradigm. You've got the numbers down there on the left. You've got control vocabulary terms and keywords over here on the right. And you've got conjunctions that refer back and disjunctions that refer back to the previous line through the line numbers. Now, interestingly enough, there is something a little bit odd about this search strategy. Now, I didn't write it, so I don't know if the original author intended it, but a little bit later in this talk, in about 10 minutes time, I'm going to show you something about this search that is a little bit odd. But I'm asking you at this point, can you see what's odd about it just by reading it? That's the challenge. All right, and I'll leave that thought with you as well. And I mentioned media monitoring. So there's also examples over here on the right of complex expressions when companies want to monitor their reputation on the web or gain competitive intelligence. Again, it's a huge industry. Those instances of people, places, and things, those mentions, are generally retrieved through a set of tools which at some point in that technology stack will have some sort of Boolean formalism. And we've got examples over here on the right of that. So, and they get more complicated. This is one from media monitoring. This is actually just a tenth of it. It crashed PowerPoint when I tried to copy the whole thing in, but that's just an example of it there, just the first bit. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to concentrate on just one particular domain. Obviously, we talked about 4 here. I'm just going to focus on healthcare search. And I mentioned that most of us, and let's just think, we can think about COVID, right? Are masks effective? You know, how much is transmitted by aerosol? What's the best practice around social distancing? There's lots of opinion out there, but medical guidance, medical interventions and guidelines are normally based on what's called, you know, an evidence-based process. In other words, we try to get all the evidence around a particular research question or topic, synthesize it in order to get the best possible answer that we can. So how does this work? Well, typically it's in the form of what's called a systematic review. So healthcare information professionals and clinicians and other allied specialists will gather as much of the relevant literature as they can, analyze it, and then synthesize it in order to provide an answer to that clinical question. And then that in turn provides the evidence base that underpins the healthcare that you and I and everybody gets. Okay, and that's generally how it works in evidence-based medicine. So far so good. That all sounds very reasonable. And then we look at the data out there, and we find that there's actually more and more evidence. So again, that seems a positive thing. If you look at the amount of systematic reviews or the amount of trials that are out there, you'll see something like this, close to a power law, effectively, with an exponential growth of the amount of information. So there's plenty of evidence out there if we can retrieve it. And again, the process of retrieval is quite sophisticated too. Some folks on this call might be familiar with what's called the PRISMA flowchart. In other words, there is a systematic approach to gathering this evidence. So it goes through an identification stage where there's a search that takes place, database search typically. That then goes through screening, through eligibility, and then through down by a couple of orders of magnitude into being the documents that are included in the review. And you can see we've got some citations over here. We've got documentation on PRISMA itself, and we've also got the citation that this particular flowchart was taken from. So with all this available data, with all this available evidence, with all this available process, what could possibly go wrong? Well, this is where we sort of have to, I don't know whether I use the expression slay the sacred cow or whatever the appropriate expression is, emperor's new clothes or whatever. I've never found the right expression for this, but we've got to think about, actually, there are certain things about this process that don't work properly, or in my opinion, aren't fit for purpose. So the first thing is the formalism itself. As we looked at with the Boolean strings example, and I gave you a couple of challenges, but even if you didn't take the challenges, you just looked at these big blocks of text. Ironically, even though we use them for structured search, they're incredibly inefficient at communicating structure. Unless you pretty print them or format them in some way that separates all the brackets from the keywords, they're actually incredibly difficult to read. And then there's the fact that as the search strategies get longer, bigger and bigger, there's no facility for what we call abstraction. Now, there's an analogy here with software development, in the sense that back in the days when the first software languages were written, it was a similar thing. The abstraction didn't really exist. As you wrote more and more code, well, you just had more and more code. But software languages sort of matured and developed, and the principles of abstraction came along, such that you could hide the detail and just see the overview, or vice versa. So you could manipulate these objects in a much more flexible manner. And we went beyond just a big block of text. So we built in abstraction, we built in encapsulation, we built in object orientation and inheritance, and all the other things that make modern software development possible and robust and reliable and effective. They don't really exist yet in the equivalent for Boolean strings. And then the final thing, those two arguments that are presented there are essentially sort of analytical arguments, but even if you don't accept the analytical argument, there is a very strong empirical argument, which is that on the occasions when audits have been done of published search strategies, and there are several examples of these, and I've just cited one there from 2019, a significant number of errors are found. Now, and when I say a significant number, the study that predates that one, there's one from 2006, which found that actually 90% of the sample that they took, and they looked at 63 published search strategies, 90% had one or more errors, and 80% of those errors harmed recall. So what can we conclude from this? We could conclude that people aren't doing their jobs properly, but I don't really think that's the case. I think this is more systemic. I think the issue here is to do with the formalism and the tooling, and that really is the inspiration behind the work that we've been doing, myself and colleagues, over the past 2 or 3, maybe 4 years. So I'm going to very quickly segue into a couple of bits, sort of related workplace elements. These couple of slides come from a colleague of mine. I should point out that this is joint work. I should shout out Andy McFarlane, who I think might be on the call, has contributed a lot to the thinking behind this. Farad Shakroni as well. I don't know if he's on the call. He contributed both these 2 slides, so I'm probably going to murder them with my interpretation. It's his voiceover that we're missing. But he's given a very good account of the issues that he's an information professional, that information professionals face. And for the sake of 60 seconds, I will probably do my best to faithfully replicate the issues that he's articulated here. So the first one is the peer review, as we saw with that process, a little bit like code, many mind, the more eyes you can get on this problem, the better and more robust the outcome. So peer review is a crucial part of search strategy development, but at the moment there isn't really a kind of publicly available forum for doing that. Then there's the search strategy development process. It's very document centric. People typically use Word or other document-centric tools which introduce issues of their own to do with auto conversion of quotes. The word processor is trying to help because it thinks it's language, it's not. So it does things that you don't want. It does truncation, auto correction, space removal, and all sorts of things that make these search strategies sort of silently fail because characters have been transformed that you didn't want to be transformed. And similarly with PDFs, ever tried to copy text out of PDF? It's a nightmare. So there's all sorts of issues with manipulating and passing PDFs around as the format for search strategies. Then there's the whole issue about reproducibility. As I said, science is all about building on the work of others, standing on the shoulders of the giants who went before you and being able to understand and reproduce their methods. So if we can't do that with the tooling and the formalism that we're using, then that really does need some thought and some attention. Then there's a whole bunch of issues around the colloquial understanding of Boolean logic. When we talk about and colloquially, we tend to mean a disjunction, cats and dogs. Doesn't necessarily mean the conjunction of the two. It often means the disjunction, and conversely, if we talk about cats or dogs, that the logic is reversed. So the colloquial understandings don't necessarily match the formal semantics of how most Boolean systems implement these things. Then there's a whole issue around translation. Patent searchers, healthcare information professionals need to query multiple databases in order to gather evidence, and there's a significant overhead of translating their search to the syntax of these individual databases, and there's a lot of errors and inefficiencies creep in with that process. Then there's the sharing. The search strategy, as I mentioned, in PDF and Word doesn't tend to really work that well. So there's a whole range of issues around the practice of sharing search strategies. I'm noticing some things in the chat. Please do feel free to stop me. I'm not sure. I'll probably, unless there's a kind of a sort of question of clarification, I would probably carry on and address these at the end, unless there's something that's kind of urgent. Okay. So I'm not sure this will really work. I've got a little bit of sort of comic relief built into this talk at this point. It doesn't kind of really work unless I'm in the room, but I will try it with you and you just got to imagine everybody thinking it's funny. You probably won't, but I'll try it anyway. So I normally say at this point, this is a quiz. One of these images is from 2010 and one is just from 2020. And I invite people to say which is which. And most people inevitably go, oh, it's pretty obvious. That's the one in the background is 2010, the one in the foreground is 2020. And we all go, yeah, well done. That's absolutely right. And then I show them a search, an advanced search, 2 versions of an advanced search query builder. One from 2010 and one from 2020. And a lot of head scratching takes place at this point. And then the kind of the punchline is I go, is there a difference? And most people go, no, there's no difference whatsoever. So there's a little bit of mirth or humor in the fact that The IDEs have changed massively during those 10 years, and the software development, thinking, and formalisms. Advanced search, not so much. We're still using Boolean logic, and the query builders pretty much have not changed. Maybe they were perfect to begin with, but the evidence does not bear that out. Given the number of errors that are in published search strategies, I don't think you can say they were perfect to begin with. Anyway, so this is where we're going with this thought, is that search strategies are complex logical constructs. They're read many more times they're written. They exhibit all these characteristics that we associate with software. They need to be maintained, shared, and optimized. And this is exactly what the software development community has been working on for the last few decades. And my screen's just gone blank, and I've no idea why. I'm just hoping. Oh, there we go. It's come back again. I think it was just a glitch. Yeah. So as I say, it's a bit of what you might call lateral thinking. Borrow ideas and thinking and concepts from another discipline and bring them into the discipline of information science. So this is where we bring things back full circle with talking about the title, because it was a play on words with a book with which I'm sure many of you are familiar, Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. And in that he talks about, you know, the two types of two systems, one of which is, you know, intuitive and rapid and fast and sort of hardwired into us, and the other one which is slow and procedural, and it tries to be rational, and it thinks it's rational, but it's actually not, and it makes lots of mistakes and so on. So I'm drawing a distinction between these two, that the paradigm at the moment with advanced search is essentially procedural, and it's static, and it's monolithic, and it's strings. And the question that I'm asking is, can we move to a different way of thinking that's about declarative expressions of information need, making them interactive, making them executable, and treating them as objects that we can do all sorts of clever things with rather than just blocks of text. So I'm conscious of the time. We're nearly at 6, but I think we're kind of on the home straight now. Yes, in fact, we are. So that really leads us to this kind of thought experiment. Well, what if we could visualize search strategies? What if we could use metaphors that user already understands, separate these two tasks of keyword selection from query manipulation, provide all this other tooling like scratch pads and debugging aids, provide instant feedback, real-time feedback, support these issues that are raised around abstraction, and also provide other things like query suggestions to help with the generation of these search strategies. And there's a huge history. As I said, progress in science is predicated on standing on the shoulders of giants. We're not the first. There's a ton of other people that I'm going to summarize 30 years, 40 years of research in data visualization for query formulation in 2 slides. Annick 1989, very influential work, also Fishkin and Stone. There's a very interesting story to these, but in the interest of time, I'll just gloss over them. More up to date, there's something called Boolio, which uses a grid-based metaphor for recruitment search. Similarly, the Search Whiteboard, David Newman, librarian colleague down at Exeter, very interesting work, does his stuff using Excel, and he's got a huge array of adapters that make his approach very flexible for lots of different databases. And of course, there's the stuff from Queensland University in Australia, Search Refiner, again, very influential, very significant work. And they use this tree-based metaphor and lots of other interesting developments around search strategy refinement and optimization. So that really leads us to the 2D search bit, which is the spin-off, as I said, from UX Labs. And I'm not going to spend too long. I'm just going to give you a sense of what it does. Essentially, there's a canvas on the left and a result pane on the right. And concepts are objects on the 2-dimensional canvas, and you express relationships, you articulate your information need by manipulating these objects on the canvas. So straight away, that designs out the missing bracket problem, because you can only articulate syntactically correct expressions. Arguably also it makes the semantics more transparent, because you can see on the canvas, using the sort of thinking fast, what we call pre-attentive attributes, the shape of what it is that you're articulating. And it also supports arbitrary levels of abstraction, so you can collapse and expand, zoom in and out, like Google Earth. You know, you can look at your house or you can look at the world, doesn't matter, you just zoom in and out. And we like to think of this as kind of like a Lego analogy. So we support optimization through exploration. You can't break anything. There's always an undo stack. You can go right the way back to the start. You can save at any point. You can execute things. You can enable, disable. So you can play with this thing almost to try out different approaches, different strategies, and refine your approach. So at the moment, we've got it integrated with, that's actually now 10 databases and counting. So it integrates with lots of IEEE Explore, Lens, Trip Database, Epistemonikos, lots of databases. So as I said, there's 10, it will be 11 at the next release. It raises interesting questions about, is there a sort of holy grail of a universal representation for structured information needs? We have what I might call like an 80% solution. There's bits that we can't really represent visually, or haven't tried to yet, I should say. So it kind of raises the question, could we create a visual language, which is the union, I guess, of all the individual, you know, the Tower of Babel of all the different languages that there are at the moment for doing structured search? What might that look like? As I said, we've got an 80% solution. That last 20% is really the hardest bit. Actually, we've probably got more like a 90% solution, because it's sort of the edge cases we've still got yet to do, but they're kind of the hardest parts, as you might imagine. There's a lot of auto translation built in. There's a lot of error checking built in as well, which I probably won't have time to talk about today. And we recognize that the world is not going to change overnight. No matter how much we say, try this, it's new, it's different, it's arguably better, the world is built around Boolean strings, and probably will be for quite a long time to come. So we allow interoperability, so we have an import function and an export function, so as we can live harmoniously with the sort of old world and new world, if you want to look at it that way. A few minutes ago, I asked the question, did anybody know how many conceptual blocks are in that healthcare strategy? Feel free now to put a number in the chat window, because I'm going to show you the answer, and it's not quite so much fun once I show you the answer, but feel free to have a go. All right, interesting. Oh, Jonathan, good to see you on the call. So, all right, feel free to keep dropping them in, and here is the answer. If you read that search strategy into the 2D search tool, it visualizes it on the canvas. Yeah, well done. It's 4. We get 4 blocks out. Now, I added the names manually, which is good practice. They weren't there in the original search strategy, again, because the formalism doesn't really support annotations, but this formalism does. So we added them in, and you can see it's a kind of Pico search we've got going on here, which I'm sure is familiar to many of you. We've got a population, we've got an intervention. There's probably no comparison, but we've got a type of study, and then we've got a whole bunch of exclusions as well. So that's an interesting comparison. This is what I'll call the fast thinking, and the reading the search strategy as well. Right, just a couple more slides, and then I'm going to stop for questions. Remember, I also said there was something odd about that pattern search strategy. Did anybody notice what it was? And again, it's one of these things, it's just a bit wacky when you look at it, and I'll show you, but just hold the drum roll just for a second. It's almost impossible to spot by reading it. To be honest, I've had that search strategy in my back catalogue for 5 years, and I never noticed anything weird about it until I read it in to the tool, and this came out, and I thought, that's a bit odd. Look at line number 5. Why would you do that? Why would you have line number 5 included twice? Again, maybe that's what they wanted, but to me, that doesn't seem quite right. And that's the whole point. I'm sure that search strategy went through peer review. If they did, they missed it. Or surely somebody should have said, that to me doesn't look right. So maybe there's a pattern searcher on this call who can say, actually, it is right because of X, Y, Z, but I've yet to hear an explanation why you would want to include the same line twice. It just doesn't seem to make sense to me. But the point is that it's only now we can see that that potentially is an error. All right, so I'm going to round out. Where does this all leave us? And I'm going to shout out some joint work with Andy McFarlane here. We have a set of design principles around which we like to sort of coalesce a community of like-minded individuals to work on the future of advanced search. I'll just go through them real quick. Support the transparency and the mapping between logical and physical structure, so as to support that the pre-attentive attributes to support fast thinking, basically fast searching. Adopt the scalable formalisms that accommodate complexity, so to design out the errors. Delegate the low-level syntactic operations to system functions, so that's all the translation. That should all just happen automatically for you. Up to a point, I know there's certain things that can't be translated automatically. Provide real-time feedback on query effectiveness, so people can try what-ifs, as they almost adopt a playful, experimental exploration of the space of possibilities, so they can refine their search effectively, and provide support for collaboration and team working, so that the sharing is seamless and that people get perfect digital verbatim copies of what you produced rather than distributing it through Word documents and so on. So just a final sort of thought is, obviously at the moment for this talk I've talked about the technology, but my own sort of belief is that's only part of the solution. I think what's interesting, what's missing is that the rest of the ecosystem is content. Where does the content come from at the moment? I mean, I think about GitHub, right? How that has transformed the efficiency and the ability to learn of the software development community through seeing examples of best practice and being able to take code and reuse it and change it and massage it and do all sorts of other clever things with it. I know GitHub's not the only one, but it's the one that we all know about. So where is the GitHub for search strategies? And then there's the community of practice, the sharing of ideas, the sharing of best practice questions, answers, and solutions. What we call the Stack Overflow, right? Where is that? So that's the other sort of piece of this jigsaw that I could imagine. It doesn't exist yet, but I certainly think there's a real opportunity here for like-minded individuals to get their heads together and create something. So I think that's pretty much it. As I said, I've started off by talking about the problem. I've talked about some of the issues with the formalism and the tooling. I've talked about some alternatives. I glossed over 4 decades of prior art, unfortunately, in the interest of time. But I've presented, joint work and some solutions here. So the conclusion is, it's all about reimagining advanced structured search. Eliminate the syntactic error. Make the semantics transparent. Provide support for the collaboration, the reuse, and the optimization. And the key sort of thought is that transformation. Slow thinking to fast thinking by changing from procedural static monolithic strings to declarative, interactive, executable objects. You can try it for yourself. It's totally free. You just go to 2dsearch.com. There's lots of videos and help and blog tutorials and so on. So feel free to have a go. And that's it. So thank you very much for your time. Sorry, I overran a little bit. I hope that wasn't too self-indulgent, but yeah, so I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you for that, Tony. That was really interesting, really thought-provoking. I had no idea that recruiters were Boolean ninjas, so that was an interesting thing to find out. There are a couple of questions in the chat, so I'll just quickly go through those. And then if people want to either raise their hands on Zoom or simply pipe up with a question. The first one, which I must admit I wasn't sure about, was also was from Koala. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Was, what do you mean by conceptual block?
Oh, anything that would help you understand that search strategy. Just I mean, just when you create these things, you essentially break the information need down into what are called facets. So all the librarians on this call, you're more expert at this than me, but my sort of interpretation of that is essentially just any structured information need. Let's say you were writing a report on the effects of exercise to counteract obesity in older people. Your facets would be the population is older people, the intervention is exercise, and the outcome is obesity or the lack of it. And that process leads to conceptual blocks, which are articulated either procedurally as blocks of text or as blocks on a canvas. So that's what I meant by conceptual blocks.
Okay, thank you. Another question was about about the search in the database and also talking to the database creators. Most medical librarians know how to avoid syntax errors. Andrew kindly answered that by saying that you were referring to logic errors, not syntax errors, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I'm just having a look.
So it was when you mentioned things like adding a wildcard and it being misread or corrected, I think.
Yeah,
that was where
I've just put the, are you referring to the one, I don't know if you can still see my screen. Are you referring to this one, the one that I'm highlighting?
We can only see the last slide at the moment.
Oh, I see. Oh, that's probably Zoom. Okay. So,
let me just check.
Yeah, go back. I'm just scrolling through the chat now. Oh yeah, I see the one about conceptual block. Yeah, okay. And Andy's pointed out, yeah, PICO is a framework for identifying those conceptual blocks. So I'm looking at Paula's question at 0654, which I guess is the next one on the list. Nikki, is that right?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it was a follow-on.
Yeah. That's right. Most medical know how to avoid it. Exactly, yeah. It's not so much with learners, though. Obviously, they'll make syntax errors. And these syntax errors do exist. This is the irony, really, is that despite the due diligence of lots of individuals, when these audits take place, the number of errors that are found is always pretty high. So they must be coming from somewhere. It's not just syntax errors, obviously, but syntax errors are, they do exist. Yeah, but there's a whole taxonomy of errors. In the Glanville and Sampson McGowan paper from 2006, there's a breakdown of all the errors that they cover. So you can see a sort of more detailed analysis of the different types of errors.
Okay, Paula would also be interested in hearing your opinions on PubMed automated search mapping.
I don't, you mean automated term mapping? I don't really have a strong view on it. I mean, I'm aware of the fact that it kind of ruffles a few feathers amongst the expert search community because they want to switch it off basically to get the control and more transparency. That's at least my understanding of the one side of the argument. But it's back to this thing, I guess, about who's PubMed designed for, and I think it tries to serve two communities. It tries to serve the expert search community, but it also tries to serve communities who aren't trained in structured searching, everybody else basically. And to that extent, automated term mapping tries to emulate, I guess, what a lot of the web search engines do, that they're very loose in how they interpret a query and they try to do a more sort of semantic matching. But the price for that, of course, is the transparency. You lose the transparency and you lose the reproducibility, because if they change their algorithm, your results all change, so you can't get that reproducibility. So I understand both sides of the coin, and I think PubMed has a tough call, really, trying to satisfy both. Thinking out loud, I guess the obvious thing is to put a big switch on the screen so you can turn it on or off, but I guess they haven't done that, given that this debate, I think, is still raging. That's my simplified view. As I said, though, I'm not a librarian, so I'm sure there is a more nuanced interpretation of this argument among the community here.
Okay. I think that the final question that's actually is in the chat at the moment. Oh no, not quite. Would you be able to put the links to, into the chat?
Yeah, what the links to? Yeah, I'm just scrolling down the. Paola has asked another question about logical errors with database creators. Yeah, to a point I have discussed them, and we have very good relationships with like the Lens and Epistemonikos. You know, it's a very fruitful dialogue, you know, that we have, and they welcome what we're trying to do, integrating with what they're doing, and they see it as you know, mutually beneficial. Other bigger providers are a little bit more hands-off. They go, oh, well, you know, not really interested in what this tiny little startup's doing. So it kind of varies. You know, some have got an appetite for having a dialogue and saying, look, I like what you're doing. It's really interesting, and we have regularly talk, you know, and others not so much. So it kind of varies. So I'm just working my way down the list. On John's question at 6:59. Yeah, talking about the pattern search, I would love to know. Oh, two other quick observations. You know, I asked that question, how many search blocks were in that healthcare search strategy? I must have asked that question about 5 times with an audience. I mean, we've got 37 on the call today, of this size and bigger, and only one person has ever got it right out of probably about 150. And I have paused, you know, several times. So I'm just, anyway, just something to think about. And also, nobody has ever been able to tell me whether that patent search was an intended duplicate or whether it was an error. So I'd love to know the answer to that. So yeah, I was just following up on John's comment about the patent search there. Okay, yeah, copy the links. Do you mean the links to the tool and everything else?
Yeah, I think
okay,
so.
Yeah. Well, actually, the link to the tool is just on the screen there. Actually, should I stop sharing at this point?
Sorry, is that? Oh,
sorry, go on.
I was going to say, is that the web address that was on? Because we saw web, Twitter, LinkedIn, etc.
Yeah.
We saw.
I can.
The presentation would be available on ISCO website, so people can always visit there and take note of the links.
Yeah. I'll just put the URL in the chat window now.
Thank you.
So here you go. So there's the tool there.
Fantastic. And then Martin White has a question. He has a concern that professional search is somewhat ambiguous. There's a professional.
You are so right, Martin. Yeah, I know. Yeah, and the trouble is, if you Google for professional search, I mean, I get the point that that's what you find on LinkedIn. You probably find search engine optimization specialists. We get all sorts, I'm afraid. I'm just reading the second part of your question. I can't think of a better description. Yeah, maybe expert searchers. Actually, you kind of touched on it actually in your comments. So when I talk to I find it difficult to come up with a concise definition. I do. To answer your question, yeah, it is tricky having to define. I mean, I think this community has a fairly, you know, a good understanding of the search community and what we are referring to as the professional search community within that. But yeah, I take your point entirely that if I was giving this as a TED talk, I'd have to spend the first 10 minutes just defining what professional search was. I'd love it if you've got a silver bullet. Martin, do you have, feel free to jump in. Or anybody.
I think that was it on the chat so far. So
okay.
Do we have any questions from anybody that are not in the chat?
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, can you hear me? My name is Paula.
Hello.
Hi, Paola.
Okay. Now I was just wondering, going back to PubMed automatic mapping.
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, what they do is to try and match search terms to useful mesh headings,
Yeah.
subject headings, in order to amplify the search.
Yeah.
But actually, you can actually switch it off. For example, if you use phrase search or truncation.
Mm. Yeah. Although I think,
I'm not sure about their algorithm.
yeah.
I mean, the main problem is that I can't really, be sure how to find out exactly what their algorithm is.
Exactly. And I think when you said you can switch it off with truncation, not a lot of people know that though. I think it turns itself off, doesn't it, rather than telling you it's turned off.
Yeah, exactly. No, it doesn't do that. It just gets switched off,
Yeah.
because normally it puts sort of automatic search mapping puts Boolean operators
Yeah.
and or in between concepts.
Yeah.
It
Exactly.
also tries to identify, sort of match up search terms to keywords to mesh subject headings.
Yeah.
Okay, at the same time and so on. So many people are not aware of it.
Yeah.
What goes on, in the background.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's not really clear and transparent what it's doing.
Yeah.
I appreciate what you're doing and so on, but I think you really should talk to the, to the developers of these sort of databases and so on.
Are
They're
you
all very
referring
different.
to?
And I think, I'm not really a medical librarian,
Yeah.
I sort of help out with searches and, training and so on.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think most of the medical librarians have become adept at finding out, how to carry out searches in the best
Yeah.
possible way,
Oh, yeah.
taking into
Absolutely.
account, all of the quirks of the different databases, because they're all
Yeah.
different, of course. And it would be really nice if there could be a kind of sort of way of searching across
Yeah.
all databases that medical or not, that actually, to actually bring in some useful results.
Yeah.
Because I think most of the users are not really aware of it. And of course, there is, this conversation going on between users and medical librarians and users and different kinds of
Yeah.
librarians and so on in different fields and areas.
Yeah.
Because they sort of mediate between users and, databases and help them with their searches and so on. But I mean, it seems to be a bit of a minefield, to be honest. And PubMed is such a beast.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I think we've just got a couple of other questions in the chat. So I've got one from Eugene. I wonder if you have any thoughts on other program paradigms that translate to expert search. Interesting. I hadn't actually, but now that you mention it, that's an intriguing thought. Yeah. Nice. That is something definitely to ponder. Patterns is a one, I guess, that would be an obvious candidate, wouldn't it? You're talking about design patterns there, which would have a sort of analog at the conceptual level of code writing, at the same level of maybe would they manifest themselves with a visual representation, is an interesting question. Okay, so that's a nice thought. Just picking up on Andy's comment, I think that tacit knowledge, professional expert searchability. Yeah, exactly. Well, this is the tricky thing, right? Because sometimes when I give this talk, I have to tread a fine line. At the same time, I want to offer something new and I want to question the practices of the past, but I'm conscious that everybody hates the idea of disintermediation and the spectre of AI taking everybody's jobs. I know it's overhyped, but there's this thought in the back of everybody's minds. So I'm conscious that I try not to play that card too strongly. And then the way I think is probably the best way to articulate the opportunity and not the threat is simply to talk about learners, because we found that the biggest take up of people who are now using the tool, ironically, although we aimed it at professionals originally, the biggest take up is students doing literature reviews, researchers doing literature reviews for their PhD thesis or their master's thesis. for them it's a game changer, because instead of having to, you know, trawl all these databases, understand what they are, understand in syntax and map it across, they can just go to one place, they can write one search, they can get it peer reviewed by their colleagues, and boom, they do it across all their databases and they're done. And they even press the generate search report button and they get their search report. So they love it, you know. So maybe they're the future, I don't know, but that's the irony, is that even though we aimed it at professionals, it's actually the newcomers who are really taken to it. So I'm just wondering if there's another question. Session recording. Oh, I'm not sure about session recording. That's probably a question for Arif. Okay.
Yes, the session is recorded and would be available via ISCO UK website.